Good evening and welcome. My name is Gwendolyn Mahon, and I am the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at the University of New England. We are so glad you could join us tonight for our annual George and Barbara Bush Distinguished Lecture. I would like to begin by asking you to please silence or shut off your cell phones, if everybody could do that. I also just wanted to note that only approved photographers may use flash photography at this event. So I joined UNE last November, and I have thoroughly enjoyed jumping into campus life. One of the things that has impressed me about UNE is our commitment to civil engagement and to thoughtful discourse. This event exemplifies that spirit, and I'm just delighted to be here this evening with all of you. At this time, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce University of New England President James D. Herbert.
Thank you so much, Gwen. And what a delightful thing it is to work with Gwen. She is a force of nature, and we're having so much fun together since she arrived just a few months ago. So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the University of New England's 12th Annual George and Barbara Bush Distinguished Lecture. It's so wonderful to see so many UNE students and members of our faculty and professional staff, trustees, members of the Bush family, neighbors, and just everyone here from Maine and from away gathered for one of UNE's annual signature events. We offer this series as a way of celebrating the remarkable lives of President George Herbert Walker Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush. We're fortunate at UNE to befriend these exemplary Americans during their later years, and this lecture series serves as a lasting tribute to the connection that we forged with them. The Distinguished Speaker Series has brought to our campus through the years and has graced us with much wisdom, the various speakers, and I'm sure this year's visitor, Dr. Richard Haass, will do the same. But before I introduce him, there are just a few other guests here tonight that I'd like to acknowledge. We have several current and former UNE trustees in attendance at this evening. At this time, I'd like to ask them all to rise and be recognized. Trustees, please. Thank you so much, all of you, for your service to UNE. As many of you know, this series has been made possible through the leadership support of the Whalen family. We are deeply saddened by the passing of our dear friend Peter not too long ago, but we are grateful for his wife Rosalind and their son Paul and daughter-in-law Bethany that for their continued support and for being here this evening. So Roz, Paul, Beth, would you please rise? Thank you so much for your ongoing support of this series. We're very grateful, really appreciate it. The Bush Foundation also deserves recognition for its support and encouragement of this series, and I know many of our friends in Texas are watching via live stream. So how about a round of applause for our friends in Texas at the Bush Foundation? And I also welcome everyone else that is able to be here tonight. I'd also like to give a special acknowledgement to Ms. Doreen Bonanami from the Council on Foreign Relations, who was generous with her time and attention to helping make the arrangements with UNE to bring Dr. Haass with us. Doreen, thank you very much. She's not able to be here with us tonight, but I'd like to give a round of applause to Doreen for all of her help. Although President and Mrs. Bush are no longer with us, their presence continues to be felt here at UNE. Our George and Barbara Bush Center, where my office is located and Gwen's office is located, reminds us daily of these two iconic Americans for whom it is named. Furthermore, our George and Barbara Bush exhibit chronicles the Bush family's love affair with the state of Maine, their presidential years, and the Bush family's connection to UNE. And if you haven't explored this gem on our Biddeford campus, please do so. Please make a point to do so. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. The President and First Lady exemplified the commitment to public service that characterized America's greatest generation. Leading by example, they dedicated their lives to others. They were role models in their time, just as they continue to be today. At UNE, we had the privilege of getting to know them on a personal level. They ventured up the Saco from time to time on their boat to visit campus, taking a special interest in our students and their activities. Our UNE family and their family bonded over our shared passion for brightening the lives of others. Today's speaker has similarly dedicated his life to serving others and specifically to serving the country that he loves. From 1989 to 1993, Dr. Richard Haass was Special Assistant to President Bush and Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council. During this time, he was awarded the President's Citizens Medal for his contributions to the development and articulation of U.S. policy during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Later, he served in George W. Bush's administration as Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass also served as U.S. Coordinator for Policy toward the Future of Afghanistan and as U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. For his efforts in this latter regard, he received the prestigious Tipperary International Peace Award. For the past 20 years, Dr. Haass has served as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan organization dedicated to helping people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. He's also the author or editor of 16 books on American foreign policy, management, and democracy. His latest book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, was released by Penguin Press earlier this year and has already made its mark as a New York Times bestseller. And I highly commend it to you, by the way. It's an amazing book. I just finished it last night. At this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce the 12th speaker in the George and Barbara Bush Distinguished Lecture Series at UNE. Please join me in giving a big nor'easter welcome to Dr. Richard Haass.
So I feel I'm 12 talking about 41. You can do the math. It's great to be here. Thank you, sir. Madam Provost, thank you as well. Great to be back to Maine. It's been a while. I want to talk a little bit about my former boss, the 41st president. And to put some of it in perspective, I've been thinking about it a lot recently, given where we are in the world, and I'll try to connect the dots before I'm done. And I'm not going to go on too long, and because I'd rather have hear what you've got on your mind and go back and forth on a few things. But President Bush, 41, was there at the end of the Cold War, and I actually didn't think I would ever live to see the end of the Cold War. It was one of when you woke up in the morning, it was part of the structure of international relations. But it ended, and we can argue the date, but for a lot of people of all dates, it wasn't 9/11, it was 11/9, 1989, when the wall was first torn apart, dismantled. And the fact that the Cold War not only ended full stop, but ended when it did and how it did, peacefully, after 4 decades, and on terms that could hardly have been more favorable to the United States and the West, was simply beyond imagination. There's very little, though, about history that's inevitable. And a lot of people, success has either 100 or 1,000 fathers. And there were many over the 4 decades that came before in this country and other countries in the West. But I think the 41st president deserves more than a little credit for essentially easing the transition. So much of history and often conflict is about momentous changes. And change often causes friction, and friction essentially becomes too much for those entrusted with authority to manage, to handle it. It overwhelms their bandwidth. and this did not. And it was both what he said, what he didn't say. He got criticized at the time, if you recall, for not being sufficiently celebratory and so forth, but he was already thinking ahead. And his view at the time was, look, this is the guy on the other side, Mikhail Gorbachev. He had to manage a transition for his country, a political and psychological transition. And the last thing President Bush wanted to do was make that more difficult for him. So it wasn't just that his mother taught him not to gloat and to be modest, but also it carried over into his statecraft. And the whole idea was to appreciate the predicament of the other person, to think long term, and to say, I know where I want to get this relationship. I want to get the world from Cold War to post-Cold War, and I want to do it peacefully, and I want to do it in a way where I don't undermine the people I'm going to have to work with down the road. And again, in retrospect, success always looks inevitable or easy. Didn't seem quite that way at the time for those of us working with him at the White House. It wasn't much later, about 8-9 months later, in the summer of 1990, where essentially we went from what had been the beginning, or rather the end of the Cold War, to the first test of the post-Cold War period. And that is when Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. And it's interesting just to put in the context of today, because think about it, one of the big arguments then is we cannot allow the precedent to be set that territory can be acquired through aggression. And that is why the president stood up. I was the young aide, a lot more hair, meeting him on the South Lawn of the White House that day in August 1990, when I gave him a report about what was going on. And he said, this aggression against Kuwait, this aggression, it will not stand. And those were the fateful words of his presidency. And here we are 30 years later dealing with aggression yet again. Aggression across borders, the attempt to acquire territory by force. And I think it's interesting that the principle he so clearly stood behind is again the principle animating a different president, the 46th president, Joe Biden, in trying to rally, if not the world, at least the West, against this latest form of aggression. But if one goes back to 41, one had the end of the Cold War, the first test of the post-Cold War period in resisting Iraqi aggression. And when he stood up and talked about it, in part after talking with Brent Scowcroft, who was the first speaker in this series, he talked about the desire for a new world order. And the whole idea was he was trying to manage this crisis of dealing with Iraqi aggression against Kuwait, not simply to push back the aggressors, but to do so in a way that would set norms and arrangements and patterns of or habits of international relations that would stand us well for years or even decades to come, which is why the United States rallied an international coalition, worked through the United Nations, worked through the Congress in successfully resisting aggression. And then, when things on the battlefield were going extraordinarily well, also not overreaching. He basically said, we have a mandate, domestically and internationally, I don't want to go beyond it, and we did not, to use the expression of the day, march on Baghdad, but we contented ourselves with restoring the status quo of pushing out the aggressors. I say all this because here we are 30 years later in a very different world, and from the optimism of the New World Order, we suddenly find ourselves in a world that suddenly looks very dark and pessimistic in certain ways. And that's what I've been wrestling with recently. How did we get to this point? And I wanted to say a few things about it here. So after 30 years, what we are seeing is what? First of all, despite the optimism of the New World Order, what we're seeing is something that looks very much like the old world. We're seeing cross-border aggression, unprovoked aggression, in this case, Russia against Ukraine. And it's part of a larger story. Whereas 30 years, academics were writing articles and books about the end of history, about the triumph of the West, about the triumph of democracy, suddenly that looks rather premature. And what we're seeing again in Europe is a revival of geopolitical, not just rivalry, but conflict. And we're seeing it more broadly around the world between the United States and China. So the United States now finds itself directly at odds with Russia in Europe, working with our NATO partners there, and more broadly arrayed against what's seen as the threat posed by a much stronger China, a China that also is more repressive at home and more statist economically. We've also got other geopolitical challenges in the form, say, of a North Korea with a growing missile and nuclear arsenal, with an Iran that is using all sorts of tools to promote instability in the Persian Gulf. So one of the principal challenges of this world, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, is this revival of geopolitics. Indeed, if I were thinking about this in the sweep of history, and I think what we were actually experiencing is we've gone from the post-Cold War world of George Herbert Walker Bush to now what you might describe as the post-Cold War world. We've actually entered a different era of history where, for many reasons, the optimism of that previous moment has not lasted or has not been borne out. So think about it, the Cold War lasted 4 decades, from the late 40s to the late 80s. The post-Cold War world lasted 3 decades. Now we're in something of a new era. We don't yet have a name for it. We don't quite know its character, but we do know it's going to be extraordinarily demanding and difficult and dangerous, in part because we face, once again, major power rivalry, as well as the challenges or threats posed by medium powers around the world. But that's not all. And by the way, if this seems like a talk to encourage students to study international relations, you'd only be partially wrong. Because if you do, you will never be unemployed. The second thing going on, and it's one of the things that gives this period of history, again, its own unique coloring, is we don't just have a revival of the familiar stuff of geopolitics, but we also have global challenges. We've just essentially gotten through a pandemic that claimed well over 1 million American lives, nearly 20 million lives worldwide. And what we saw was that despite the unbelievable science of the mRNA vaccines, global arrangements were simply not in place to deal adequately with this challenge. The global institutions meant to deal with global health were simply not up to the task, in part because governments were not prepared to cooperate adequately. And climate change is yet another example. Just this week, the New York Times ran a big story, essentially how we're falling farther behind. The gap between the world and where it ought to be is growing. The trajectory we're on is truly dangerous. And again, it has the potential, and at some point even to dwarf geopolitics as a defining feature of this century. I am not wildly optimistic about the chances for diplomacy in this regard. I think it's very hard for governments to think long term. All the pressure is to think narrowly and short term. And if there's hope, it may be in the realm of technology. We'll see. We'll see what the private sector can come up with, perhaps with government help, whether it's in the areas of alternative fuels, new generation of nuclear reactors, better batteries, carbon capture, what have you. We will see how this works out. My point is simply, we live in an extraordinarily difficult era of history where we have a renewal of the traditional stuff of history and geopolitics and the arrival of the stuff of modernity, which are the dangerous, difficult manifestations of globalization. But then there's a third factor. In addition to geopolitics, in addition to globalization, and that's the question of us, of the United States. Again, take a step back. When you look at the last, say, 75 years, from World War II through the present, the United States has played an outsized role in the world. And I would argue that for all the difficulties that have been encountered, for all the flaws and so forth, it has been an extraordinary run of history. After World War II, we avoided great power conflict. We didn't avoid all conflict, but we avoided great power conflict. Just contrast the first half of the 20th century with 2 world wars, and what's happened subsequently. It was a period of an unbelievable increase in wealth across the world. The colonial period ended after World War II for the most part. The average lifespan in the world went up by decades. More people came to enjoy a degree of freedom and democracy than ever before in human history. Not bad. Not bad at all. And one of the principal reasons this was so is because the United States was willing and able to play a large role in the world in many ways. One, by the example it set. It showed that democracy could deliver. It could deliver not just politically, but economically and socially. We made progress dealing with some of our challenges, what Abraham Lincoln called the unfinished work of America, narrowing the gap between our principles and our reality in many areas when it came to the rights that Americans were able to enjoy. And the United States also played a large role in the world, forging institutions, and obviously not just forging, but providing the foundation to alliances in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific region. And the question going forward now, at a time, again, that we face these dual challenges of geopolitics and globalization, is are we going to be able and willing to play that kind of an outsized role again in the world? Because the one lesson I have from history is that without us, it's not clear to me the world will be or would be willing and able to meet these challenges. And for the first time in my career, I'm not so sure what the answer is. And when I often speak to groups like this, people ask you, what keeps you up at night? Is it the geopolitics? Is it the globalization? And I say, yeah, all those things worry me. They obviously concern me. But what really keeps me up at night is us. Whether we are willing and able to play the kind of a role that has proved so essential for over the years, which is what brought me to finally, as a foreign policy guy, to write a book about American democracy and about citizenship. And there's lots of things that I think have slightly gone off the rails in this country, but a lot of them I would put in a framing that we have gotten so obsessed with our rights, what we are owed by our government, by our country, that we've lost sight of our obligations, what we owe one another and what we owe our country. And if you think of citizenship as a coin with two sides, one side is rights, and again, I already referred to Abraham Lincoln, the unfinished work. We've got to make good on our rights. 3 years from now, we're going to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It would be a wonderful moment to, if you will, finish Lincoln's unfinished work, to close the gap between our principles and our practices. That would be a wonderful goal. But even if we were to do that, even if we were to somehow be able to finally close that gap, I would argue it wouldn't be enough. And the reason is that in a democracy, rights are not enough. They are essential, but they are not sufficient. And the reason's I think, pretty straightforward. Rights inevitably come into collision with one another. Think about it. A woman's right to choose versus the rights of the unborn. Someone's right to bear arms under the Second Amendment versus someone else's right to public safety. Someone's right not to get vaccinated or wear a mask versus someone else's right to health. So how in a society, how in a democracy, do we navigate a reality where our rights collide? It's interesting, former Justice Stephen Breyer on the Supreme Court, said the toughest cases that come to the court are not the cases of right versus wrong. Those are pretty straightforward. It's right versus right. That's what really challenges a democracy. And when rights come into collision with one another, if you can't find a mechanism for resolving them, what happens then is at best you have gridlock, that you can't get the political system to work its way through it, or worse yet, we descend into violence. Whoops, missed my glasses there. And what we saw on January 6th was a descent into political violence. And what we've seen long before January 6th and often after January 6th is gridlock. And the reason that obligations are so necessary, it gives you a way to hopefully work through the differences in a way that would forge agreement, compromise, and make it possible to improve things here at home, to act in the world in ways that are consistent, and obviously to avoid violence and to once again be a democracy that others around the world would hope to emulate. It won't just though happen. I love one of the things you're doing on this campus, which is this marketplace of ideas. It's classic liberalism, it's tolerance, it's respect for intellectual and political diversity. That sort of thing, I would argue, needs to be done across the country, not just in educational institutions, but in all places where Americans come together. So you're setting, I think, a wonderful example here at UNE and what you're doing. But we need other things as well. We need citizens who are prepared to get informed, to get involved. The fact that we just had a critical midterm election where more than half of those eligible to vote did not is there's something deeply wrong there. We also need politicians, political leaders who are rewarded for making reasonable compromises, for acting civilly towards one another, for putting country before party or person. It's up to us to reward those who do that and penalize those who don't. Religious leaders have the pulpit. They should be preaching, again, the importance of civility, openness to compromise. They should be rejecting violence because of political differences. They need to stand up for the importance of each of us looking out for our fellow citizens. We are our brothers and our sisters' keeper. I think in particular, one of the things we should think very hard about is making civics a staple of everyone's education in this country. We would not think about having a young man or woman graduate school unable to read or do basic math or work, some basics of computers. Why do we think not preparing them for citizenship in a democracy is any less essential? I simply do not think that anyone should be able to graduate from high school or college and not have under his or her belt the basics of citizenship. What is it that makes a democracy valuable? What does it make? What is required of citizens for democracy to operate? How does it work? And so forth. What are the basics of our history we have to know? We're the most heterogeneous society on the planet. It's hard to run a society filled with people of such different backgrounds. The way America has done that over the centuries is that we're a country ultimately based on ideas. We're based on values, many of which are in the Declaration of Independence again. But the challenge for us has been is that we haven't been teaching it. And what we're learning, I think, and we've got something of a wake-up call, is that we can't assume our narrative is transmitted. We have to take the lead in transmitting it, and that again is the obligation to teach civics in our schools, to promote public service and so forth. All of which brings me back to George Herbert Walker Bush. When I think about his life and his career, so much of what he did exemplified, I would think, what we want. Obviously, he was involved in public life. He was open to compromise. Indeed, he paid an enormous political price for compromise when he put together a deal with people from both parties on taxes and spending. Paid an enormous political price for it, but he did it. Why? Because he thought it was in the best interest of the country. He was always civil in all of his human relationship. He was a respecter and a protector of norms, of doing the right thing. It wouldn't have occurred to him not to have acted in ways that reflected what was expected of him as a political leader. He did believe in standing up for the common good. What he did for Americans, say, with disabilities was a remarkable piece of civil rights legislation. His entire career in life was a testament to government service, from his time in the military to his time in the White House. The way he encouraged his own family to follow suit. It wasn't a coincidence that one son became a governor and a president, another son became a governor as well. And indeed, all of this was about putting country before party or person. So, it's easy, I think, to grow pessimistic. It's easy to despair at times when we look out what's going on in Washington or in various state capitals. But I think his career and his life is an example of that good people can accomplish important things and stay good in what it is they do. And my own sense is when history is written with the passage of time, he will emerge as one of the most successful and important presidents in this country's history. And my own reading of it is that we were fortunate to have him when we did, because again, the great struggle of his moment in history was the end of the Cold War, and I just don't think it was baked into the cake that it would turn out the way it did when it did. But actually, it took some very careful, judicious handling of events. So I hope from some of that, it gives you, particularly younger people here, the students, some encouragement to think about careers in government. I'd love for the best and the brightest to once again choose government as either a stint or as a vocation. You can make a difference on a big scale. And if you choose to go that way, you could do a lot worse than model yourself after the 41st president. Why don't I stop there? And I'd love to have your questions either about matters of civics and citizenship, or rumor has it there's 1 or 2 problems in the world going on that are filling the inbox, so we could probably talk about that as well. But again, let me thank you for having me here at UNE. And again, let me applaud you and the president for what it is you're trying to do on this campus and making it a model of civil discourse.
Folks, we have microphones to the far left of the stage and far right. You're welcome to come on up to the microphone, and if you're unable to come to the microphone, raise your hand and I can bring this to you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, good to see you again since lunch.
Brooke.
Yeah, hello. Hope you enjoyed your day on campus so far. So you were talking about how it's so important to be strong at home, to be strong overseas. So my question to you is, how do we promote healthy nationalism?
Thank you, Brooke.
Hey, you said to bring the heavy-hitting questions. So.
There we go. I didn't mean it, though. Look, nationalism's an interesting word, and I like your phrase, healthy nationalism. I think there's probably a danger in having too much or too little of it. I mean, nationalism can take many forms. It can become intolerant at home or abroad. A nationalism domestically is in many ways can be inconsistent with the Bill of Rights, and so of course it can become intolerant. So we have to be careful that we don't define Americanness narrowly. Again, it's not based on religion or race or gender or privilege or anything else. It's got to be based on values and ideas. That is the essence of this country. We were founded on ideas, and the challenge is to live up them. And then overseas, and we've seen it around the world through history, nationalism again can take forms that are wildly intolerant. And it could become an excuse for aggression. I think we're seeing elements of that in Russia's war against Ukraine. So to me, a healthy sense of nationhood, of patriotism, is one that wants to improve it. We live up to our values. I mean, it was Ronald Reagan who spoke not just of patriotism, but informed patriotism. And it's the reason in this book I made being informed as a citizen the first of the 10 obligations. I think it's basic. So I think we want to have we want to be proud. I mean, one of my few disagreements with Madeleine Albright, who was a dear friend, is I used to say, I think we are the world's indispensable nation, but I don't want us saying it about ourselves. I want others to say it about us. I think it's useful when we're humble, when we go about things in the world. So I think we ought to have a healthy sense of ourselves. The best thing we can do is show that democracy in this country is working. Others around the world will get the idea. We don't have to push it. They will see it. And they will say, we want some of that where we are. We like what they're doing there. And that to me is a healthy nationalism. And probably one other thing, and it gets into some areas of some controversy, I think we've also got to respect the nationalisms of others and have to be mindful of thinking too universalist, in a universalist way, that simply because certain things work for us, given our unique history and composition, that necessarily they're going to work for everybody. I don't buy that. I think culture is a powerful force in the world, and I think the United States has to navigate the world with a degree of humility and a degree of acceptance of perhaps the limits of Americanness around the world, that other nationalisms count. It's not that ours is better or worse, it's just different. And if others want to some extent model themselves on us or our principles, fantastic. But I think we have to be very careful about forcing it or demanding it.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Haass. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for encouraging our students to study international relations. The study of IR is actually really going down in this country, much to my dismay. I've been.
Are you a professor of IR?
I used to be, and I was trained by people who thought very highly of you. So I've been following your stuff for a long time. My question is about the post Cold War era that we find ourselves in, that you described, and specifically about the invasion of Ukraine. I think up until about a week and a half ago, my take on that was that Russia was overwhelmingly an outlier, that for the most part, the world, especially the Western world, had responded in, like united ways against that. And so that the democratic ideal in, the United Nations was mostly maintained. But just in the last week and a half, and especially because of Xi's visit to Moscow this week, plus the cooling of U.S. support in some corners of our Congress and other corners, suddenly has me thinking a totally different picture of these two global superpowers against.
Well, let me see if I can address it.
Thanks.
Look, I understand your concerns. I think first the thing just to say is, I talked a little bit about what happened in 1990 and 91, where most of the world, almost all of the world, was arrayed against Iraqi aggression. That is not the case now. You have the United States, its European partners, and a few of its Asian partners arrayed against Russian aggression. But you have China quite supportive of Russia. And then you have a big chunk of the world either supportive of Russia in part or sitting it out. So I think you're right. When you look at things, it's a lot of the world is not going against this. I think the United States has made a mistake in framing this as a struggle of democracy versus authoritarians. I think we should have made this simply a war against aggression. I think more of the world, which is not democratic, could have been sympathetic to an argument that we can't create a world safe for aggression. So I think we simply misframed it and made it too ideological. I also think that a lot of the world was not feeling very kindly towards the United States at the beginning of this war. They were, during COVID, we did not come through for a lot of the world with vaccines. U.S. trade and aid policies have not been wildly forthcoming. So a lot of the world was essentially saying to the United States, where were you when we needed you? Now you want us. Life doesn't work that way. So I think we found ourselves in a position where we didn't have a lot of, I have to be careful about using banking metaphors these days, but we didn't have a lot of capital in our account with the rest of the world. And I think that's what happens. And a lot of countries have specific things, like India gets Russian arms, other people want to buy cheap Russian energy. But I think what this is a reminder that history unfolds, and we've come a long way from a US-dominated world of 30 years ago, when 41 was president, to now. And I think, again, it's an interesting question of how did we get to this point. But suddenly, where in the old days, triangular diplomacy worked in our favor. It was the United States and China against the Soviet Union. Now triangular diplomacy is working against us, with Russia and China trying to undo a lot of the US-led international systems. So this is a moment for some reflection, I think, for people in my business, which is how did we get to this point? What mistakes did we make, and what should we be doing going forward? So you're right to be a little bit concerned.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello again.
Hello again.
I had a question regarding what would you recommend or some form of advice to college students and what we can do to not only motivate ourselves, but motivate others to participate in conversations regarding educating with civics. And then you also mentioned voting too, so, other forms of activism.
Mr. President, well, look, if you look at American elections, what's interesting to me is turnout, even in presidential elections, is usually never much above 60%, which is another way of saying 40% of eligible voters plus or minus don't vote. The recent midterms, 55% of eligible voters plus or minus didn't vote. So one thing is to get out the vote, because small amounts of voters can have outsized impact. If you look at the recent midterms, New York State, in some ways, 4 or 5 races were narrowly won by Republicans in New York State. If those districts had gone Democrat, which was what many people expected, the Democrats would still be controlling the House of Representatives. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a thing, that a small number of voters in New York had a tremendous impact. Or recent presidential elections, usually it comes down to a couple of states, 10,000 here, 20,000 there, 50,000 there. Again, this is a country of 333 million people, over 200 million or so eligible voters. So 1% increases in voters could have all the difference in the world. So there's one is getting informed, becoming and voting is a big thing, but then working on campaigns. There's all sorts of ways that students can do that. By and large, students have been an undervoting population. Often they're away from home on campuses and so forth, and not just in federal elections. It's really important. I mean, if you look at who's drawing the congressional districts and the rest, it's at the State House. So what you really want is, again, students to get informed and get involved at every level themselves, fellow students, work on your parents, work on your relatives, work on your neighbors, and then go out and work. And so that's what students, I think, can do. So do it. Sir.
Dr. Haass, thank you so much for being here and providing your incredible insight through your amazing accomplishments. I live in Kennebunkport, but my family got here via Donegal and Greater Boston. And so I think you know where I'm going.
I think I know where you're going.
And thank you for your incredible work on the Good
Thank
Friday
you.
Agreement. As you know, it's celebrating its 25th anniversary in April.
We are.
But it's a very interesting situation, obviously, in Northern Ireland. We've got the Catholic population almost equaling the Protestant population. We had amazing things happen after the Good Friday Agreement, like Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness sitting down and laughing with each other. Yet it seems like we've hit a roadblock here, and there's lots of obstacles and challenges. You've got Brexit, you've got the Northern Protocol. When you talk about two groups having their rights conflicting and colliding, it seems to me like there's no place more so that's happening than in Belfast and Northern Ireland right now. So I guess my question to you is, what is the future for Northern Ireland? What do you predict will happen? It's amazing to me that there's a discussion about unification. I never thought that that would be discussed in my lifetime. So thank you.
Look, thank you. The good news is that for those of you who are not familiar with the history of Northern Ireland, the modern history, you went through about 3 decades of sectarian warfare known as the Troubles. And somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people lost their lives. And this essentially came to an end in the late 90s. You had a negotiated agreement of the leadership of Northern Ireland, people from both religious traditions, as well as the United Kingdom, from UK and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And George Mitchell, who was my predecessor as the US envoy, deserved enormous credit as though did all the leaders, many of whom really put aside their pasts. It's quite a remarkable thing. And I think the British government deserves some credit, as does the Irish government, because what the British government said, look, over the decades, you're not going to be able to shoot your way to power, but you can negotiate your way to power sharing. And I thought that was a really important message, and ultimately it effectively worked, and you had some local leaders who were willing to step up. Since then, it's still a very divided place. 90% of the children of Northern Ireland go to single tradition schools. One of the things I got most involved with was something called integrated education. Integrated education in Northern Ireland has nothing to do with people of color. It has everything to do with Catholics and Protestant kids going to the same schools and studying in a non-denominational environment. But there's lots of problems still between the communities, very divided, not just physically and where they live, but politically. The local institutions have ceased to function. There hasn't been any significant renewal of violence, which is a wonderful thing, but there's still lots of real divisions. And I don't have a crystal ball. Could there one day be Irish unification? I suppose, but it would take a majority in the Republic of Ireland as well as a majority in Northern Ireland to support it. I don't think we're anywhere near that right now, but you have demographic changes, you have political changes, you have Brexit, which is complicated things. I think the challenge for the near term is to simply get the local institutions standing up and delivering and to avoid any renewal of violence. I think this recent agreement the last few weeks between the British government and the so-called Windsor frameworks and the EU is a welcome innovation. But now we'll see if it's enough for the leadership of Northern Ireland. It's also, I've got involved several times there as an envoy. And one of the interesting things about Northern Ireland, and one that has certain lessons for us all, it's a society, it's a small society that never came to terms with its own past. You have thousands, or maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of unresolved murders and so forth, and deaths from the period of the Troubles. Lots of other issues, and it's a question of, can a society get over the past and look to the future if it doesn't essentially come to a reckoning with the past? And we'll see. But it's been proven extraordinarily difficult for Northern Ireland to face up to its past. I think certain parallels to questions in this country. So I don't have a crystal ball. It's a good question about what's going to happen. I'd like to see gradual normalization, if you will, breaking down of the walls in the society. But I think we have a long ways to go there. It's one of the reasons I focus so much on education. Every time I went there as an envoy, I would visit an integrated school because I wanted to send the message that we needed to get the next generation learning to live together and go to school together if there was any chance of the society coming together. But I think Northern Ireland is still quite a ways away from becoming truly normal. But we'll see. It's come a long ways. It just, that's the good news. Still has a ways to go.
Hello again.
Hello again. I'm surprised you all came back for more.
Are you able to hear me?
Sure.
So to talk about one of the morals or the Bill of Obligations, you talk about being remaining civil. And in the first paragraph, you talk about civility as the golden rule, to treat others unto how you would like to be treated. In one of my philosophy classes, we kind of touched upon the golden rule, and we talked about it's quite difficult, actually, because not everyone necessarily wants to be treated the same. And you yourself today talked about how we have such a heterogeneous population. How do you go about remaining and promoting civility in a nation as diverse as ours?
Well, it seems to me civility is just another word for respect. But put that aside. I mean, one is it's how you'd like to be treated, but just be practical. In my experience, to be rude to somebody, to shout at them, to make offensive comments, it probably doesn't increase the persuasiveness of your argument. Just a wild guess. And then secondly, in a democracy, one of the things we have to recognize is you and I so here it is, it's Thursday, and you and I may be having a disagreement, the two of us, on what to do about Ukraine. But tomorrow we may want to be able to work together on what to do about some global health problem or some domestic education problem. And one of the things I like about civility is even if it doesn't get you to agreement on the issue of the moment, it preserves the relationship. So you have the possibility of working together on other issues. If the relationship ruptures over a disagreement, you not only lose the ability to work together on that issue, you lose the ability to work together on any issue. And if you think about it, it's why in some ways in places like Parliament or Congress, despite all the friction, you have this almost flowery, ornate language about the distinguished gentleman. And the whole idea is to preserve a degree of comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, as opposed to comedy, which we won't even go there. So I think there's a place for civility. It's protective. It's protective of relation. It protects possibility. And that's what you want in politics. And it doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't cost you. And one of the things I like also is when I talk to teachers about how to teach some of the ideas in the book is to do things like debates, have people debate an issue, like you do in your marketplace thing. You're having one coming up, I think, on affirmative action. You just had one on transgender. You take these subjects that are real lightning rods, really tough, polarizing issues. And I almost like a sporting metaphor. Here we are in the NCAAs. You blow the whistle at halftime and you say, okay, change sides. You now argue the other side. And I think that's a great way or change the groups. We had this side of the class and just mix it up almost by lottery. And this week you're working, this person's your partner in the debate. And I think things like that are really good because, so again, civility is all about relationship maintenance. And it doesn't allow the disagreement or the issue at hand to get in the way of relationships, which I think is a pretty good, something most people can buy into. It's also something where religious leaders could make a real difference. This is a country of people, Americans more than just about any other country, go to churches or synagogues and mosques. And I would love to see people who stand at pulpits, use those pulpits to advocate for things like civility, to reject violence in the political space, to encourage people to look out for one another or to be open to compromise. That's if people have moral authority, I would argue they ought to use it. Sure.
I have two quick things. So first off, I just want to thank you for being here, and it's opened my eyes to conversations like this that I wouldn't normally have with anybody. So
thank you.
I want to thank you for that.
You're a student here?
Yes.
Good. I hope you get I'd give you an A based on that.
Appreciate it. And then second off, it's not really the main discussion of this talk, but you mentioned briefly about the environment and climate change, and that's something I'm pretty passionate about.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you think that we can come together as a community, like a university or just a country in general, to combat this issue, as in the Gulf of Maine where we live, it's being affected the most.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know anything about the Gulf of Maine. I'll be honest with you. Look, I think in this, in various communities, states, cities, this country, it's tough. Climate change has become an unfortunately politicized issue in ways I wouldn't have predicted. I didn't quite see it coming. But we are where we are. I still think there's areas of potential compromise. I think both sides of this conversation, I'm not saying they're equal, but various sides of the conversation have made mistakes. I think, for example, there's still a role for fossil fuels for decades to come. Now, not all fossil fuels are equal, but there is a role for fossil fuels. I think we have. On the other hand, I also think there's a role for nuclear. There's a role for renewables, carbon capture. There's no single silver bullet in national policy. I actually think climate policy can and should be designed and carried out in ways that are good for jobs and good for the economy. I think it's just this side of crazy that we're expanding solar, but virtually everything we're doing, we're importing, as opposed to producing a lot of it in this country. So I almost feel like we need a timeout in the climate debate to lower the political temperature and almost to restart it and to see whether we can come up with something of a comprehensive approach to deal with energy security, economic security, and climate stewardship and to almost reimagine and restructure the conversation, because the problem's just getting worse. And I think there's a place for people across the political spectrum to come together. But I think that's at the national level. International level, it's really tough. Really tough. And again, I'm not very optimistic about the diplomatic approaches. I think, again, technology is going to be far more significant. I would think at local levels, it's to put together almost packages that have something in it for everybody. And there's got to be a big economic security component for those who, at least in the short run, are adversely affected by what might be responsible climate policies. And we have to also just make sure that our timelines, the sequencing or the timing, how do I put it, the timelines sync up. I think in recent years we got too fast on certain climate, and we were winding down certain things on fossil fuels too quickly, and we got caught up short. So I think we need to have a realistic projection of timelines on what to do on all the fronts, and at every step of the way show that it pays. So I think it's difficult, but not impossible. And I would approach it very practically, not ideologically. So I wouldn't make it I think to the extent climate change is treated as almost an ideological issue, it's a big mistake. I would just treat it almost from the ground up as a really practical issue. And then I think there's a chance of getting some fairly broad political support. But good luck and stick with it. Yes, sir. Josh.
Yes, thank you again for coming today and for answering my questions earlier on your book. So switching gears over towards your other kind of expertise. As I'm sure you're aware, the countries that are what we call the BRIC countries, or BRICS if we include the S there, and the recent peace agreement that was made between China and brokered by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and now this week as well between China and Russia. Should we be afraid and worried now that we have an agreement that we're not part of, that now holds the most oil, that holds the largest population in the world as well?
I'm going to reassure you, Josh. Okay? You're going to sleep better tonight after you hear this. Look, the United States over the last 3 presidents has made a strategic decision to dial down its involvement in the Middle East. We can argue whether that's right or wrong in principle. We can argue whether it's right or wrong in how it was done. The fact is we've done it. So you can't dial down your presence and involvement and not expect that things are going to happen. Sure. And what's happened is other outsiders, in case of China, have gotten more involved. China, by the way, is a massive, much more than us, is much more dependent on Middle Eastern energy than we are. So you have that. You've also got the locals wanting to become more autonomous. The Saudis weren't too happy when, late in the Trump presidency, Iran attacked Saudi refineries. The United States didn't lift a finger. Saudis weren't so thrilled about that. They also weren't so thrilled when the United States, in this administration, kept pushing them very hard on human rights issues and democracy issues. So they wanted to send us a message of sorts. We have no relationship with Iran whatsoever. So the idea that something like this would happen, that China would step in a bit, China likes the idea of appearing as a peacemaker. My reaction is not to get too worked up about it. Plus, it's not at all clear to me about what exactly Iran and Saudi Arabia have agreed to do other than to reestablish diplomatic relations and reopen embassies. Is Iran going to stop doing all the things around the region that give Saudi Arabia heartburn? Probably not. Is Iran going to stop its development, putting into place the precursors of a nuclear weapons program? Probably not. So I doubt we're entering the golden age of Saudi, but Iranian relations. But just say we were, and if we like the terms, the fact that China brought it about, I don't think we should allow concerns about China to get in the way. If China does something that's good, it's good. If China does something that's bad, it's bad. But look at it on its merits. Just because it's China, I'm uneasy about China and Russia, what they're doing, because I don't think they're particularly up to good, to say the least. But if imagine miraculously enough, and I see zero evidence of it, that China could do something useful in influencing Russia over its policy towards Ukraine, and that may either lowered the temperature of the war or made some type of a peace agreement more possible on terms that we could live with. Just because it's China, I wouldn't reject it. That seems to me silly. Again, I'm skeptical about it. But no, I think, again, if they do good things, great. And in the meantime, I'm not saying we should leave the playing field to them. If we have important interests like we do in Ukraine or wherever, then we should be involved. And if we have ideas diplomatically or what have you, then we should be promoting them. But nature tends to abhor vacuums. And if there are vacuums that grow up, we should expect opportunistic actors to fill them. And if we're uncomfortable with that, then it seems to me it's incumbent on us to do more. But I haven't seen anything of late in the Middle East or elsewhere that China's up to that I think somehow represents a serious threat. To me, the only real serious threat they pose is whether if they were to become much more supportive of Russia, not just economically and diplomatically, but militarily. That would be a big issue, and hopefully that won't materialize, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr.
Yes, sir.
Haass, we're at a point where we will call for last question here.
Okay, do it. I apologize. I'm going on too long. We can get 2 last questions, and I'll be really quick. I apologize, really. And then just get this young lady, and then we'll go.
All right. I want to thank you so much for coming again to be the sentiment of all the students here and all the faculty and all the visitors. And my question relates to me more as you being a foreign policy scholar working in smaller states like Northern Ireland and Cyprus with interstate tension. How can those smaller geopolitical issues, and what lessons do you learn from them? And how can they really apply to these newer macro geopolitical issues we face in our current time?
Okay. And yes, ma'am.
Hello again. My question is, how do we infuse a sense of obligation in a society that feels like government deprives them of their rights and privileges?
Okay. 2 good questions. The former, look, the stakes may be different, but to give you an example, whether you're talking about Northern Ireland or Cyprus or anywhere, there's lots of insights you can get about negotiations. Negotiations only work when you have parties on the various sides of an issue who are willing and able to make a deal. So when people spend all their time fussing about the details of an agreement, what really matters more is whether you have actors that, again, both willing and able to compromise. And if you don't, you're not going to get progress. So it may not have global implications, but it'll obviously have implications if you fail for the people on that square of the chessboard. During the Cold War, what was always so dangerous is local disputes could have global repercussions. If the United States was on one side, the Soviets were on the other. I can imagine that today with the United States and China, or something like that, where we're worried about the entire chessboard, to strain the metaphor. But local disputes can take on global significance if you're not careful. But even if they don't, local disputes can just be plenty bad for the locals. And so, but again, most disputes, they operate according to some of the same logic. So I actually find it useful, whether I'm talking about the United States and China, or something over Taiwan, or the United States and Russia over Ukraine, or some of these other smaller disputes. The way I think about them intellectually, I developed this theory of ripeness about what negotiators can do. I should also add that I've failed at every negotiation I've been in charge of, so I probably wouldn't take me very seriously here. But I do think the way you think about them doesn't change depending on the stakes. Okay, so last question. Look, I think you raised a big issue. How do you get people to think about obligations if rights aren't filled? I think the answer is you have to keep pressing ahead on rights. And we are. We've made real progress in the United States over the last 240 or so years. We haven't closed the gap between our principles and our practices, but we've narrowed it. We fought a civil war over it. We've had civil rights legislation. We've had other forms. Women have the right to vote. Right to vote is down to 18-year-olds. There's other changes in this society that are quite impressive. Is there still discrimination? Of course there is. Now, you can't always deal with legislation through, discrimination through legislation and the law. Behavior and the rest, but you keep working it. And again, it's where people with moral authority, where parents and others have a potential role. So I think the answer is you continue to work at what, again, Lincoln's unfinished work. You don't give up. You don't say good enough. But to use the academic structure, it's necessary but not sufficient, because even if we finished it, we'd still have problems. So I think what you try to do is you continue to work that account. At the same time, you make an argument, like I've tried to make in this book and today, that even if we were somehow to finish it, it ain't enough. And our democracy still would not be delivering adequately for ourselves. It's in our self-interest to have a balance between, and to focus not just on rights, but on obligations. And I think you just have to explain to people how they would benefit from it and what's being asked of them. I mean, public service, yeah, it's good for the public, but it's good for the individual. You get something in addition to giving something. Or if you look at all the obligations, from being informed to being involved, to being civil, yeah, it may take something of you, but in every case, I think you get rewarded and then some. And I think you have to, indeed, you could probably make the argument in some cases that some of those obligations, if played out, might actually increase the chance that some people who have not been particularly respectful of certain rights might become more respectful. That there might, so there's obligations have two sides. There's the side of them that is what's normative. It's the right thing to do. It's the proper thing to do. But also there's a practical, it might actually bring you some desirable effects. And I think you can argue it on both sides. But I would never argue that an emphasis on obligations means less emphasis on rights. I'm much more worried about the opposite. We've almost exclusively asked ourselves, what does the government owe us economically and politically? We've stopped asking Kennedy's question about, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I don't think we ask that nearly enough. And I don't think we ask ourselves enough what we can do for our fellow citizens. So I'm not arguing against rights. I'm arguing for obligations. And I think it's a different thing. But thank you. And thank you all. That was awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, thank you so much. That was, I know you've given us all a lot to think about. You certainly have me. I have lots of questions and thoughts. So thank you so much. And thank you all. You have my heartfelt appreciation for being here tonight. Thank you for coming, and please stay engaged. We have lots more interesting events coming up. Watch the website and come join us. So thank you again.